Good afternoon, everyone. I am Alan Solomont, the Dean of Tufts University's Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life. Welcome to Tisch College's Distinguished Speaker Series. Today's guest, United States Congressman Joe Kennedy III. Before we get started, I want to thank the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute and Jumbo Vote for partnering with us on today's event. I especially want to commend Jumbo Vote, a student-led initiative to get the entire Tufts community ready to vote. I want to commend them for their tireless work this semester in that effort. We are now less than a month away from November 3, and I know that everyone has voting and the election on their minds. While we pride ourselves on bringing speakers to campus from all diverse walks of civic life, we've been focusing on political topics this semester. So far, the Distinguished Speaker Series has featured former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick, former Democratic presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg, and political commentator Van Jones. And all of those appearances can be seen on Tisch College's YouTube channel. In the coming weeks, we will host a panel on politics and the press with journalists from Politico, NPR, and NBC Boston. We will hear from LaTosha Brown, the co-founder of Black Votes Matter, as well as from Congressman Adam Schiff, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Please go to tischcollege.tufts.edu/events to see the full lineup of speakers and to register for any of these events. And you can find full videos, as I mentioned, of speaking events this semester on the Tisch College YouTube channel. Today, we welcome a political leader who can offer his insights regarding national as well as local politics, the state of the Democratic Party in 2020, and what it's like to run for office in the face of a global pandemic and other national crises. Joe Kennedy III is a four-term United States Congressman representing the 4th Congressional District in Massachusetts, which stretches from the suburbs of Boston to the cities of the state's South Coast. Born and raised in Massachusetts, Joe is a graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law School. He has followed his family's deeply valued tradition of public service. After serving in the Peace Corps, Joe began his career as an assistant district attorney in the offices of both the Middlesex County DA and the Cape and Islands District Attorney's Office. In 2012, Joe was elected to Congress, where, among many other issues, he focused on education, innovation, and economic development. He is a staunch advocate for vocational schools, community colleges, as well as for clean energy, and he serves on the influential House Energy and Commerce Committee. His Perkins Modernization Act and STEM Gateways Act, which focus on expanding educational opportunity for middle-class and working-class students, were both signed into law, as was his Revitalize American Manufacturing and Innovation Act. Joe is a national leader on issues of mental health and substance use disorder. He led legislative efforts to strengthen mental health parity laws, expand Medicaid coverage, and ensure that all children and pregnant women have access to mental health treatment. As most of you surely know, Joe ran for the United States Senate this year and lost a hard-fought battle to incumbent Senator Ed Markey in the Democratic primary. We are grateful to the Congressman for joining us today and for sharing his thoughts on serving in the United States Congress during some of the most politically challenging times in our nation's history, as well as his perspective on this unprecedented election season. I'm going to begin with some questions of the Congressman, and then we'll open it up to questions from our Zoom audience. So please keep an eye on the chat feature for instructions on asking your questions. Hello, Congressman. Welcome. Good to see you. I think you're muted, though.
I am. Good to see you, Ambassador. A pleasure and an honor to be with you. And thank you to you. Thank you to the students that facilitated this, and very much looking forward to the discussion.
Well, let's get right into it, if we could. At Tufts, our mascot is an elephant. So let's discuss the elephant in the room. Last month, you lost a very high-profile U.S. Senate primary to Senator Ed Markey. I'd like to give you a chance to address that in terms of how are you doing? Are you glad you ran? Was it worth the risk of losing your seat in the Congress? And what's next for you?
Ambassador, thank you. Am I glad I ran? Yes. And I would do it again in a heartbeat. Same information, same choice. I got in this race, got in the race about a year ago, a little over a year ago, end of September. And Alan, if you gave me that same opportunity today, I would say yes. Politics is a tough business, and you realize certainly as a elected official, as a candidate, there's very little of this that you control, and so you do your best to try to navigate through it. And I don't want to say this was the only issue, but obviously trying to navigate a race that I felt was the way that I thought I could run a race and highlight the issues and the causes that I care about was severely limited because of a global pandemic. Those things happen, right? Not really necessarily global pandemics, because something like that hasn't happened in a while. But again, landscapes change, and the context of campaigns change. I'm not the first one where that's happened to, but it's part of the challenge that you have to acknowledge when you jump into a race like that. And you don't get in there a race like that unless you're willing to lose. And I was. And look, I'm disappointed that I did. Mm-hmm. But what I tried to talk about and the issues and the people and the causes that I tried to talk about, I think are really important for Democratic Party to acknowledge. And I think there's a lot of work that we need to do there. Look, of the gateway cities, some of you will know that they're the working class cities in town, the cities across our state. I won 16 out of the 21 of them. We won the black vote overwhelmingly. We won every black ward in Boston. We won the Hispanic vote by even more. We won Chelsea, we won Lawrence. We won Lawrence 70-30. We won many of the working class cities across the state overwhelmingly as well. And I'm really proud of that. And I think there's a message there for a Democratic Party too about the need to make sure it's not just that we're saying we're doing the things that and putting forward the policies that less advantaged communities care about, but it's that you're doing that in a way that earns their respect and their support and their vote. And am I disappointed we came up short? Yeah, of course. Do I think that that's the end of my ability to contribute to, again, those people and causes? No. Do I know exactly what I'm going to do next? Nope. So I'll spend I've spent the last several weeks kind of cleaning up the campaign when you're running as hard as we were. And all of a sudden the thing stops suddenly. You got a little bit, you need to find a mop and a broom. And we've been trying to take care of the campaign staff and find everybody jobs and placements and clean stuff up as that happens. Had to be back down in Washington for the last couple of weeks as well, as we're trying to get some of this, keep government funded and then work on a COVID package, among some other things. And looking forward to hitting the road, vote both virtually and physically a bit for Vice President Biden and Kamala Harris, going back and forth with their team right now, and potentially doing a pretty aggressive swing around the country in a bunch of those swing states for them as well. So plenty to do and a lot that needs to get done in the next month to make sure that, from my perspective, we get the country in a far better place.
Well, you've raised a lot of issues I want to ask you about, including youth voting. But first, let me ask you, what was it like being a candidate under these unusual circumstances? How did you have to adapt your campaign and the issues that you discussed? And what are the lessons for other candidates who are running right now?
Ambassador, it was, and I'm not sure this is a uniform statement, but it probably is. I would imagine if you ask most folks, they'd say something similar: miserable. And I think particularly difficult for all of us, period. Democrat, Republican, across the board. It's not, no one perhaps despite semi-popular belief, if you are an elected official, you've convinced somebody, at least one other person, to vote for you. And that means that you have to have some ability to engage with people and to earn their trust and their support. And what COVID did is limit our ability to go out and do that. And look, that ended up being far harder, and I think in a challenger position, we've seen incumbents actually do pretty well across the board. Not obviously in every race. There's been some upsets here, particularly in House races, Democratic House races. But by and large, we've seen incumbents actually navigate through a COVID world better than they would have. And I remember talking to our pollsters as COVID kind of started to hit in Massachusetts a month, 6 weeks into that. And they said that they had seen across the board, Democrat and Republican across the country, a couple point bump for incumbents, no matter what. And I think that's reflective of when all of a sudden people face an unprecedented crisis, horizons shrink and people focus on the basics, and they're searching for some semblance of stability. I think that happened to some extent. I think there's also a pretty strong argument you can make for change there. And I think it is interesting that while we're seeing incumbents navigate through that on the one hand, well, you're also seeing that bump, well, the president got a bit of a bump initially. At the moment, this race, the presidential level, seems to be a referendum on his handling of COVID. And it does not look, at least as of now, that he's benefiting from that same incumbency protection. But look, I think from my perspective here, your ability to go out and drive a message, your ability to go out and talk to people, literally meet people where they are, all of that was limited. I had one experience, ambassador, during the campaign, where we were running around the state, and something that I hadn't expected or hadn't anticipated. I think, as you know, as many of your students will know, this has been devastating on so many industries, but on local media in particular. The local newspapers have already been subject to consolidation. A number of them were laying off staff. It happened over the course of this race. And one of the reporters said, "We don't have anybody out here to cover you, right? So we're just not covering your race." And that impacted everybody. That's not just an impact for me, but that's particularly hard if you need to get out and drive a message as to why you deserve re-election or as to why you should unseat an incumbent. If you can't get that message out, that ends up being a particular challenge. And so that was one big part to it. The last little piece I'll say here is it obviously highlighted the inequities across our society, whether it was obviously COVID-1 and healthcare and the economy and the impact that we have on quote unquote essential workers, but where we treat their jobs as essential, but still their lives as not. And then on the heels of that, at least as we were starting to get in front of it here in Massachusetts, the impact of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Jacob Blake, and these searing inequities on racial justice. And all of that was just an extremely, it's been a challenging year, I think, on a lot of levels for a lot of folks. But you're also seeing a political system struggle to respond to it. And we'll see what happens over the course of the next month ahead. But I do think that that's where you're seeing this kind of pulsating passion across our country and anger and fear, which the president is stoking, in my mind.
Well, it's certainly been a challenging year for students and for young people generally. As you know, we study youth voting at Tisch College. And it's clear that young people can influence the upcoming elections, not just for president, but for federal, state, and local races around the country. How do you think candidates and campaigns should reach out to young people in the coming days, and what message should they be sending to them to reach young people?
So, look, I think young people, millennials and Gen Z, you guys will decide this election. You'll decide it because you vote, or you'll decide it because you don't. But one way or another, you're going to decide it. And I heard quite a bit over the course of a campaign. I'm not that politically involved. I've never voted before. For younger Americans, that's not a surprise. You haven't had a chance to. I don't know enough I don't know, I'm intimidated by the process. I guarantee you, one, you know more than somebody else that's voting. I guarantee you that. Two, if you don't, you cede that voice to somebody else that's going to vote. And the idea that you don't know enough, one, you already do, but two, take some time to learn, ask some questions, talk to your friends, do some research with the newspaper, look online, try to educate yourself about it because it is important. And I think while oftentimes younger voters might be dismissed or patronized to or spoken down to about this, I look at it the exact opposite way. Look, for most 18, 19, 20-year-olds, this country, this world is going to be yours far longer than the people that are running it, who aren't going to be there for, in all likelihood, 60 or 70 or 80 more years. Those 18, 19-year-olds will be. And so this is more your world than anyone else's. You should have a stake in that outcome. You do have a stake in that outcome. So why wouldn't you make your voice heard? Why would you settle for letting the choices of somebody that isn't going to be here for all that long, that isn't perhaps as cued into the issues and topics that you care about? Why would you cede your voice to to those individuals rather than say, hey, if you're in that position of power, you're in that position of power because we, the voters, ask you to be there, and we're going to hold you accountable to it. And so I would urge everybody to make your voice heard, because if not in this one, how much more stress has to go on our system before people stand up and speak out and want to participate in that process. And we hear all the time, Ambassador, that people say, well, it doesn't matter, things aren't going to change. I understand that change is awfully hard from a presidential level to have that manifest down to the local level. But man, we've seen an awful lot of change in the last 4 years. I can't guarantee you that the outcome of this election is going to lead to an immediate change for the issue that you care about. But I think it's just not true to say that the leadership here doesn't matter, because I think it does powerfully. Last piece that you asked about, how do you reach people? Look, this is part of the challenge of this moment, right? Which is normally you go to where people are, right? You meet them where they are. You meet them on college campuses, at schools. You meet them physically where they are. You got to meet them digitally where they are, right? Whether it's by Zoom, which isn't anywhere nearly as engaging, or social media platforms, or where people are where young people's attention is kept, but and is taken. But we need young people to also drive that conversation too, right? And be active participants in it, and not just, yes, politicians, elected officials need to approach you and meet you where you are. We also need you to engage, because if not, that disconnect between a younger generation who's going to be responsible for cleaning up this mess and an older generation that hasn't done necessarily, I think, hasn't been as attuned to the challenges that we're leaving a younger generation, that disconnect widens.
Well, some good news. Based on our polling, young people are highly motivated to be involved. 83% of young people that we polled, these are 18 to 24-year-olds, believe their generation can change this country. And 79% said that the pandemic has shown them how important politics is in their daily lives. And I just looked at some numbers about turnout at Tufts among our students. Registration in 2016 among Tufts students was almost 90%. And turnout in 2016, which was not a high turnout election, as you know, was actually 67%. So we have a great campaign that's run by students called Jumbo Vote, that wants to make sure that every student at Tufts has the information and the resources that they need in order to safely vote between now, either before or on November 3. But as you know, there are a lot of barriers that have been put up and efforts to try to prevent folks from showing up. And I guess I want to ask you, what concerns you the most as we approach this year's elections?
That's a dangerous question, Alan. What concerns me the most? I mean,
you can speak freely. I have to be a little bit more, down the middle.
It's a long list of what concerns me the most at this point. This year has been one where every time you sit there and say, well, it can't get any worse, it seems to find a way to outdo you and say, oh, well, you haven't thought of this yet. So look, I don't have a lot of confidence in the character and integrity of our president. It brings me no joy to say that. you know, I think that at one very, recent example, somebody that would, after getting literally the best healthcare anyone could get possibly in the world and getting an entire wing of a hospital wrapped around him, so the best doctors you can find in experimental treatment and the rest of it, to come back and minimize the impact of a virus that put him to the hospital, that he would somehow think that he would hop in a car and take a spin and endanger the health and safety of the Secret Service members that are in the vehicle is just all of that stunning. So I think I've got concerns as to what by public press reports and some of my conversations with and scuttlebutt that goes around the hill, the concerns that the president very clearly is laying down the foundation to try to discredit the results of an election, and the kind of scary and very concerning contingencies that then Democrats have to start to plan through and say, okay, well, if he tries to say the results in X, Y, and Z state are not official or should not be recognized, and the influence that he then tries to exert on those governors to not certify those results, what does that mean, and how does that cascade forward without trying to alarm an American electorate? Because we need people to go out and vote and to have confidence in that system. The best remedy for all of that, Alan, is the one that you started with, which is vote, right? Vote and vote big. Leave no doubt as to the crowd size on this one, right? It matters, not just that obviously from my perspective that Vice President Biden and Senator Harris win Massachusetts, but there's a difference between winning it 55-45 and 90-10. And so go out there and vote. And everybody can, and everybody that can should. And we need people to make their voices heard and to believe in the system, because the only way that we're going to make it better is if people believe in it and roll up your sleeves and try to get it done and fix it.
I want to go back to how the pandemic is affecting people. We're approaching the 8th month since the COVID pandemic changed everything. As you talk to people in your district, travel around, what are you seeing as individuals and families and businesses, especially small businesses, try to cope with the pandemic and its effect? And how can we continue to support the people in Massachusetts? What, in your opinion, do they need the most?
Alan, so people need a lot of help. They need help. They still need help, and they're going to need help for a long time, right? And look, I think what many of us know or have found out or have learned, and some more personally or viscerally than others, is just how vicious this pandemic has been on highlighting the inequities for our society. And look, for many, no one has, I don't know of a single person that has not been impacted by this virus, right? But for some, that means working from home, a lot of Zooms, huge inconveniences around childcare, or what to do with elderly parents or whatnot, and how to navigate your way through it. But essentially inconveniences that you've been able to navigate through. For others, the consequence has been literally deadly. To this day, the communities that we are seeing, many of them across Massachusetts, where we are seeing increased rates of infection, are the ones that have always had the increased rates of infection. It is still communities like Chelsea and Revere and Brockton and Lawrence. And yes, a couple of other super spreader events that have popped up now in the Merrimack Valley and whatnot. But the fact that Chelsea and Brockton and Lawrence have been on the top of that list for 8 months is stunning, right? Lynn, I mean, I was at the Community Health Center in Lynn back in June, and they were still worried about gowns and gloves. And gowns, particularly at that point. The fact that this is something months into this crisis we were still worrying about. I walked through minority parts of Boston doing business walks. We couldn't do house parties because of COVID restrictions, so we stopped in on some businesses. You go through off of Bowdoin Street, a black part of Boston. You go through Grove Hall, or you go through Upham's Corner. And I remember going through, it was Grove Hall, probably a dozen businesses. And of the dozen or so that I stopped in on, 10, I think, didn't get any sort of federal assistance. Nothing, not a dime. Didn't know about it, didn't know how to apply. English wasn't their first language, had no idea how to navigate it, hadn't got a response yet, nothing. And these are communities that their clientele is largely minority. They're less well off economically. But if that money's not coming through, that entire system is at even greater stress. And look, I think that's where this issue on representation is so important. We need to acknowledge that. And we need to not just say, hey, the solution to this is more money into a system, because money wasn't the problem there. It wasn't that, at least for many of those businesses, that there wasn't money in a PPP program. It was that they couldn't get access to it. Mm-hmm. And so it's thinking through the redesign of that system. And if the design is as best as we can do it, thinking through, like, why aren't there caseworkers that are literally going door to door in those communities saying, hey, there's money here that you as a business owner should get because the guy across the street or down the street or the family and the community in Brookline, the community business in Brookline or Newton or Wellesley or Needham is going to get it. You should too. We're here to help you walk through it. And that hasn't happened. We did a lot of it from my own office, but that ain't going to be enough. And it's that issue on representation that I think we need to think an awful lot more about, because it's not just enough to say, hey, it's there, good luck, go access it, when there's structural barriers there that prevent that from happening.
I understand there are the structural barriers and the systemic problems that we're facing, but there is a money problem too right now. I know one of the reasons you were in Washington was to see if the House and the Senate and the White House could come up with a relief package. And it doesn't look very good. I wanted to ask you one, do you have any hope that they will come to some sort of agreement? And since what's separating them is a lot of partisan rancor, is bipartisanship dead in this country? And what will it take to revive it? Two-part question.
I don't think bipartisanship's dead. Look, from my own perspective here, look, it's even gotten more polarized over the course of the past several years since I've been there. And I think the president is, front and center on the reason why, right? Not a whole lot of effort at actually engaging Democrats or folks on the other side, just kind of consistently in an us versus them mantra of political governance, which can be effective politically, but is devastating for those that see a president and say, hey, you're my president too, but why are we not counted in your calculus as to the most effective way to govern a country in a republic? From my own perspective as a member of Congress, my job is to try to fight for the people I represent and the values that I hold. And most of the time, 99% of the time, and I think 100% of the time from on the district as a whole, those align. You're not going to make everybody happy in your district all the time, as you all know. But that's actually the strength of a democracy, right? You have reasonable people come down differently on different issues. You do your best, you explain it to people, and they actually give you a bit of grace in that. So my job has been, I think, to stand up and fight with everything I've got when Republicans led by this administration have tried to attack things like healthcare or immigration or LGBT rights, others, to stand up and fight back against them. It is also to try to find, with my Republican colleagues, where any opportunity where our interests overlap to advance those. I have never, in my 8 years in office, never had the luxury of having a Democratic House, Senate, and presidency. So I've never been able to say, hey, I'm going to draft the perfect bill the way I want it, and be able to count on the fact that that's going to move through a political process, a legislative process, without adjustment. I have always had to find a way to say, hey, here's what I want to do. How can I shape this or frame this or articulate this in a way that is going to get enough Republican support that they're not going to block it? And for years, on a Republican-dominated House of Representatives, get John Boehner or John Boehner or Kevin McCarthy or Paul Ryan to sign on to it and to champion it, to help bring Republicans together. And I've been, I think, pretty effective at doing so. it doesn't mean, on tax reform, on health aspects of healthcare, immigration, yeah, we fight. But when the community health centers, which are the backbone to our healthcare system, as you know, they are recipients of massive amounts of federal funding every year. They came to me a couple of years ago and said, we're about to run out of funding. I was able to broker a meeting with them and Kevin McCarthy, the Republican majority leader, number 2 Republican in the House, to help make sure that funding came through. And I'm proud of having the relationships to be able to navigate through that. That gets less attention, but they're important still.
And your great uncle, who was the author of the Community Health Center Act, which I think in 1966 would be very proud of, knowing that you've been fighting to continue fighting for that. Speaking of representation, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about reforms that you have proposed in our democratic processes. You support ranked choice voting, which is going to appear on the ballot in Massachusetts on November 3rd. Could you give us a brief explanation of what it is, why you support it, and do you think, if I may, it would have changed the results of the Democratic primary in your own 4th district of Massachusetts?
I'm not going to speculate as to what would have happened in the 4th district of Massachusetts. But I think we can be very clear about what happened up in Maine, the 2nd district of Maine last cycle. So ranked choice voting, essentially, I think you all are pretty familiar with it, is meant to combat the circumstance where you have a very crowded primary field. You've got somebody that you like, but you are concerned that that person might not be able to win the election outright. And if you are in a circumstance where it's where you don't have to have somebody win by 50%, so you can win an election with 24%, then you have the chance that somebody's going to represent a district by only winning 20+% of the vote. And so ranked choice voting says if nobody gets to that 50%, your votes, essentially, if your candidate doesn't win, your vote goes to the person that you select second. And it enables a consolidation, essentially, of support behind the individual that is able to earn the most amount of support from their constituents. Mm-hmm. And I support it because it's literally a great way to strengthen a democratic process, to ensure that, go back to a presidential election with Donald Trump, Jill Stein, and Hillary Clinton, that a vote for Jill Stein essentially ended up being a vote against Hillary Clinton, which ended up handing an election to Donald Trump. You have ranked choice voting then. Those votes go as I think many would predict, which is more of them come back to Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you have a different presidency. And so this is a much stronger way to, I think it's an effective way of strengthening a democratic process. And I think that time has come certainly here in Massachusetts.
Well, speaking of strengthening democratic process, you recently unveiled the Supreme Court Term Limits Act, which would establish an 18-year term limit for Supreme Court justices. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And is there any potential for bipartisan support of this bill?
So I would hope so, to the bipartisan support piece. And Ambassador, the idea behind this is pretty straightforward. It's the acknowledgement that the integral role that the Supreme Court plays in our society, and the need for our country, our nation, to have confidence that in the integrity of their rulings, to not view literally the implementation of law as something that is going to be inherently partisan, and that therefore can get swung back and forth, and that those laws are essentially going to be just another aspect of our governance is going to be viewed through a inherently political spectrum. And so what this does, as we've seen a trend in recent history of, and particularly for this administration, to have justices, one, hold off until they have a president that is of their political leaning, to have an administration that is willing to essentially confirm or select justices that end up being younger and younger and stronger ideologically, rather than being a seasoned jurist that is experienced and that is essentially as non-political as possible. That's not essentially the qualifications that we're looking at. Yes, I think the people on the bench across the board are incredibly smart and talented, but that's essentially not that's not as much the criteria anymore. It's smart, talented, and as we've seen for the Trump administration, essentially a list come off a list from the Federalist Society. And what this bill basically does is says every president would get a chance every term, every 4 years, get a chance to appoint 2 justices, one in year 1, one in year 3. And that those justices would then serve for a period of 18 years. If there happened to be a vacancy because somebody had to resign or step off or passed away, then the person that most recently stepped off comes back on. But it lowers the temperature of these confirmation fights. It means it regularizes that process. It means that we are clear that when we select the next president of the United States, that person he or she gets 2 Supreme Court picks. That's it. It means that over the course of 8 years, you get 4. No one could still, by himself or herself, be able to sway the balance of the court, right? But it regularizes that process and I think brings down that temperature, which I think is so critically important at the moment. Thrilled to have been able to introduce it with Ro Khanna and Don Beyer. And I think this is an issue that's going to get a lot more discussion and obviously in the coming weeks.
Well, you've got 2 good co-sponsors. Actually, Don's chief of staff has, I think, without naming names, has a daughter who's a tough student. We're in the debate season. You mentioned you're going to be hitting the road for the Biden-Harris ticket. So tomorrow night there's a vice presidential debate. And what do you think? What do you think people are going to be looking for when they watch that debate? What would you advise the 2, say you're going to be campaigning for Kamala Harris? What would you advise the Democratic nominee to do in tomorrow night's debate?
First thing I would advise is not to listen to advice from outsiders as to what you should do. I think there's one of the as you know, the things about this business that that happens is you get people that are in it, particularly obviously at the highest level, get an awful lot of unsolicited advice. And I often remarked to some of them, if I walked over to somebody's house or and somebody came over, contractor came over to try to fix your plumbing, I wouldn't tell him how to do his job. I'd ask him to fix the plumbing. There's parts of this that are complicated. I've got enormous amount of faith in the capacity and capability of Senator Harris, and I think she'll do a great job tomorrow night. Look, without getting into too much detail here, because there would be some information there that I haven't seen. But I think what I would encourage and what I would hope to see from Senator Harris is what we've seen from Vice President Biden. It is competence. It is decency. It is dignity. It is a toughness that she's not going to be pushed around off the stage. I've worked with her. I've filed legislation with her, and the seminal piece of anti-discrimination law, the Do No Harm Act around LGBT rights and religious freedom, was my bill. We filed it in my first term. Senator Harris, we looked for a Senate co-sponsor for a couple of years. Senator Harris has carried it on in the Senate, which I'm proud of. It's a big piece of legislation. Her ability to articulate, I think, a common vision, to reassure the country of the capabilities that I think so many of us that serve with her are aware of, and the opportunity that she has in front of a national audience where she's been multiple times before, but to show her intellect and her resilience, I think will be important.
We ought to acknowledge, Joe, that you know a lot more about politics than plumbing, I assume. I don't know actually how much you know about plumbing, but I know you know a lot about politics.
I'd probably invert that. I'm not sure how much I know about politics, but I know more than I do about plumbing. That is for sure.
Well, we have some students lined up who want to ask some questions. So I'm going to ask the first student to introduce himself and what's your major, what year you're in, and what school you're in. Arnav?
Hi, good morning, Congressman. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm Arnav. I'm a first year from Maryland in the School of Arts and Sciences, majoring in international relations.
Great.
And I wanted to ask you, so after a lot of the recent protests and movements for racial justice, I feel like several younger progressives and students especially have called for progressive ideals such as defunding the police. And we have seen that a lot of more mainstream Democratic politicians don't necessarily agree with this, and that there can be a little bit of a gap between some more younger, especially students' ideals in this area. How do you think we can bridge that gap, and what do you think the best way to achieve such progressive goals are?
So it's Arnav, right? Arnav, excuse me. It's a great question. So I think a couple of things, right? One is the first place to start is literally the conversation, right? It's the question of, okay, engage with your local elected officials, and whether that's here at Tufts or back home where you're from, write them a letter, request a meeting, and talk to them about what it is you're actually seeking. So when we say there's been a lot written said about defund the police, and depending on who you talk to, different interpretations as to what that actually means, right? And I think part of the challenge there is that ambiguity. On the one hand, lets people say, well, we agree or we don't, but it also lets people talk past each other, because folks can say, well, when you say defund the police, I hear you're abolishing the police. And yet when somebody else says defund the police, what you're really saying is fund more mental health programs. And so getting to a common understanding as to what it is that that you as an individual or your group or your organization is actually seeking to do, why, and obtaining that information from their local elected official, like that is their elected official's job. And you deserve to know where your elected official stands on it. And that doesn't mean you're going to agree with him or her, but it does mean that after you know that position, you have the ability to hold him or her to account, right? And not only then hold him or her to account, but then build your support for your position through your community, right? Because, I mean, I will tell you from representing a district as diverse ideologically and economically as the one that I have is, from the wealthiest suburbs of Boston, some of them, to some of the, median household income in Fall River, Massachusetts is less than $40,000 a year household. So the economic realities of a lot of these challenges are very, very different, depending on where you are in the district that I currently represent. The making sure that you're talking from a common understanding as to what it is that you're seeking, and not just talking for those community groups, not just talking in one bubble, but then trying to expand that's going to be the part that is where you're going to be able to hold your elected official to account and convince him or her that your position is in fact the right one, or you're going to vote them out. Right. And so dual track, right? Engage your local elected official and work to broaden the resonance of your movement.
Thank you so much, Congressman.
Of course. And we're going to go to Jose.
Good afternoon, Congressman. My name is Jose. I'm a freshman as well at the School of Arts and Sciences, and I'm probably going to major in political science. So I know that obviously you won't need reminding about the results of the election, but with all due respect, my question to you today is, what factors do you believe led to your recent primary defeat against Senator Markey?
Jose, it's a great question and a very fair one. So I think there's a lot there, right? I think the biggest one, and I could be convinced I'm wrong. I'm not wholly sure I'm wrong on the broad part on this. I think the biggest piece of it was COVID, and not to try to take away Senator Markey's achievements in that, but the strength of my campaign and candidacy was going to be understanding that I think Senator Markey and I do define this job differently. And I think that's the way that I define the representation and the use of a power platform as a United States Senator is different than the way that he's chosen to use it. And that's fine. That's not right or wrong. I take one vision of it and he took a different one. But the way I was going to demonstrate that was being out and about in communities that Senator Markey hasn't been in very much over the course of his time in office. And I couldn't do that. One, so that limited me. Two, the impact of COVID and Donald Trump and this searing moment of racial justice meant that people's attention rightfully was on themselves and their families and what we were seeing play out across the country, not on parsing the differences between two people that looked largely the same. And it enabled, largely the same politically, but it enabled then that lack of ability for us to be able to get out there and drive a message was, I think, was devastating for us. And that didn't come apparent until the very end. I am very proud of the fact, Jose, that we won 75% of those working class cities, that we won the Black vote overwhelmingly, we won the Hispanic vote even more. We won Lawrence 73. And so I'm proud of that. The last piece I'll say on this, because I don't think it was entirely clear for many what I was trying to talk about when we talked about representation and the need to show up in communities. I was in Dorchester in Upham's Corner a couple weeks before the election ended, and there was a couple TV cameras that showed up. And one of the reporters, as they were getting set up, said, "We thought you stacked the crowd because so many people, the response for you has been so overwhelming. People driving by and people stopping you." And I said, "No, we didn't stack a crowd. This is what happens when a person in a position of power comes to a community that doesn't believe they have any and shows up over and over and over again to try to say, hey, I stand with you and we're going to fight for you." And behind me was a home and a door cracked open, and my wife was with me. She was talking to the resident I called over, and it was an older woman, probably in her 80s or 90s. And we said hello briefly. And I went back and got partway through the interview, and I got called over again, and a man had stepped out who was probably in his 50s or 60s, and we chatted for a second. And he said he wanted to help on the campaign, and I said, "That's great, thanks." And we moved off to the next stop, and my wife Lauren was taken with him a bit. And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "He couldn't read or write." And think of what that would mean every day, knowing that statistics tell you that those obviously, that there's people that they can't read or write, even in Massachusetts. But he reiterated that to my wife, and he was going to go hand out some door hangers for my campaign, and what it would mean to not be able to navigate your way through the streets of Boston on every single day. On the last day of the campaign, Jose, we were in Nubian Square, the bus station, the busiest bus station in Boston. And my wife and I, Lauren, are splitting up, and she's going to run home. I'm going to do a couple more campaign stops. And the guy before at that last stop, his name was Johnny. And as he left my wife, he said, "Don't forget about us." The last stop, literally, as my wife's jumping in the car, she hears a voice and yells, "Mrs. Kennedy." And it's Johnny. And he was hanging door hangers and passing out door hangers. And he said, "I'm helping out on your campaign. And I just want to say, don't forget about us." You all are at an incredible institution with this place led by a former ambassador that has a distinguished reputation on both sides of the aisle, that is able to get former presidential candidates and top journalists and members of Congress and everybody else to come talk to you. The fact is that over the course of your time at Tufts, you will meet many elected officials. You will, period. There's not as many elected officials that will walk through the streets of Upham's Corner and talk to folks there that just know that their presence there is valued, and that by being there, you're honoring them. And I think that that's part of a representation that I could have been clearer about. It's harder to do when you couldn't drive a message given COVID, and you couldn't be out in the communities as much as we wanted to be given COVID. But that's part of this, right? Policy is important, and I'm never denigrate it, but presence matters too, particularly for those communities where that presence is critically important. It matters.
Thanks, Joe. You've demonstrated as a Peace Corps volunteer, as a prosecutor, as assistant to the DA, as a congressman, that you haven't forgotten about Johnny, and whatever you do next, I know you're not going to forget about him either. So, but we have Jeremy lined up for another question.
Yes, thanks, Dean Solomont, and thanks, Congressman, for coming in and speaking to us.
Little louder, Jeremy.
Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. So my name's Jeremy. I'm a student in the Law and Diplomacy program at the Fletcher School. I'm originally from Watertown, but I was one of your constituents when I was in undergrad at Wheaton College. My question is, what, if anything, do you find most unique about Massachusetts state politics, either about the issues or political processes compared to other parts of the U.S.?
Jeremy, great question. Look, I think one, it is a very engaged political community, right? And other parts of the country are too, but Massachusetts is politically active, right? And an expectation there that their elected officials are going to be active and engaged across our communities as well. I think one thing that was eye-opening to me, and I don't know how unique this is to across other states. Well, two things. One, that when it comes to actually electoral reform, Massachusetts isn't nearly as progressive as we might think, right? We had to push really hard. I was actually one of the leaders in pushing for vote by mail because of COVID. But the fact is that that shouldn't be a COVID thing. That should just be a thing. Like we should codify that and make sure that people can do that as part of our process as another way to vote, just to increase access to the franchise. I've pushed for years on voting reforms to try to make Massachusetts more little d democratic. But the fact that we had to push as hard as we did to actually get the state legislature to pass those reforms, the fact that the primary, and again, this wasn't dispositive in this race, but the fact that the primary was selected for September 1st, which is a terrible date for primary. I think some of you might know it's the single amount of the day that has the most amount of apartment turnover in Boston is September 1st because of college students coming back in and renting apartments. It was designed to be a day that was actually, it is a day that lowers youth turnout. That was mitigated a bit because of vote by mail. The fact that we don't have automatic voter registration, and the fact that we don't have ranked choice voting, the fact that the power of incumbency still in the state was eye-opening to me. And so I think there's a series of reforms there, not just reforms at the ballot box that are necessary, but reforms to actually make it that I don't have a problem with people that have earned the trust and support of their constituents to stay in office. But it shouldn't just be that if you win an election once and are able to amass a small fortune in campaign finance or in your campaign war chest or personally finance a campaign, that all of a sudden means that the barriers to entry are so high that challengers can't get into it. And I think Massachusetts still has very strong incumbent protections that, again, even from my perspective, were surprising to see as that I didn't expect.
I think we have time for one more question, and Katie is up next.
Great. Hi, Katie.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Katie, and I'm the director of Student Affairs at the Fletcher School. And thank you so much, Congressman. So my question is about childcare. So the pandemic has been particularly challenging for working parents, and of course, particularly for working parents of color and lower income parents. And many women and some men are dropping out of the workforce due to difficulties with daycare or schools closing or being remote. I'm a parent of a 1-year-old and I lost daycare for many months. I understand why this is happening. And I'm wondering if you can speak to what you think the country can do to support working parents, because I know that's an issue dear to your heart.
I think it's something he can relate to.
Yes, exactly.
Katie, so it's a great question, and thank you. And it's something I can relate to. It's also something my my wife, it drove my wife a couple of years ago to found an organization dedicated to actually overhauling the way in which childcare is delivered in this country. Her organization is called Neighborhood Villages. She wrote an op-ed in the New York Times back in May titled "Why Your Childcare is Going to Disappear," and compared the economic model for childcare to your local spin class. And I mean, listen, we live in Newton. You go down to the malls here, there's literally spin classes out in the parking lots. In those same malls, there's vacant storefronts that we could put to use for childcare facilities. We are coming up with every possible way to make sure that your $30 spin class is available, but we have no idea how to cover the education for your kid so that your child can get educated, get the social emotional learning that they need, and your parent can go actually back to work. We have structured schooling in this country as a public good. We haven't really asked the question as to why we thought that should start at age 5, which is kind of weird. And age 5 that, at least as I found out for my family, age 5 by September 1st, my kids are December birthdays, so they still don't qualify. And that in 28 states across the country, including Massachusetts, the cost of early childcare is more expensive than college tuition. You get 18 years in tax incentive savings plan for one, and you get 9 months for the other. And so what does it do? It just, the economics of it force at least one parent out of the workforce to try to find some way to make this work. And it is massively to the detriment of our families, of our children, and of the economic benefit of our country. And so what can be done about it? One, a structural overhaul to the way in which we deliver childcare in this country, to the way in which we think about it. It's public good. And it needs to then actually have the funding and the structures to actually to deliver it, with the protections and the investments in a childcare workforce. Because even though it's so expensive, the actual workers are getting horribly taken advantage of. They're largely women of color. They get paid dirt. And they get taken advantage of. And so this entire system needs to be rethought, recalibrated. And it's been something I've been working on in Washington, and candidly under the guidance of my wife, who has been our powerful thought leader on this now for a while, because I think for an awful lot of families, and I'll end with this was an issue that for other generations, dad worked and mom took care of the kids. Right. And so for some of the folks that are actually in charge in Washington, this isn't, they'll learn about this, but that's not their daily reality. The economic reality now is that our society, particularly in Greater Boston, demands that both partners are working, right, in order to pay rent or a mortgage or just the cost of living. And if that's the case, someone has to take care of the kid. Gone are the days that for most families, a single wage earner covers your needs. And that economic shift, part of the stresses we're seeing around our country is that the realities to the way our society is structured has not caught up with that economic shift. And that tension is boiling over. Childcare is one of the big ways we could actually do that. And it has massive consequences across the board. When you look at the median household or median net worth of a white household pre-COVID being $247,000 in Greater Boston, for Black household, $8. Childcare would be the difference in, for some families, your ability to afford a down payment on a house, right? That's where that wealth creation comes from, right? But that difference is childcare. Not for everybody, but for a lot. There's a lot we can do here and a lot that needs to be done.
Congressman, thank you very much for spending this time with us. We really appreciate it. I know our community appreciates it. Because of the benefits of Zoom technology, we've been able to open up our speaker series not only to students, but to parents, alumni, people from various schools. And I know everybody's really enjoyed hearing from you, and will enjoy hearing from you in the future. So thank you very much. Thanks to all for joining us. Tune in for our next event. Check out the website for when that will be, and really appreciate it.
Grateful for you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.